peace. Now what I'm going to have to say for the next little while is going to be about peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace enforcement, peace support, peace whatever. You know, we've got all kinds of definitions, but I think peace whatever kind of sums it up. We do whatever the government tells us to do, and we give it to the military and the civilian folks to figure out the best way to do that, and they're very, very good at that. Some things I'm going to say are going to be critical and political, but it's designed to be a reality check, because Canadians need to understand what we are asking our men and women in and out of uniform to do. So, and some of it's going to be maybe redundant. I prefer to call it reinforcing. And you know, a Canadian's view of Canada's history is kind of summed up in two monuments: the Peacekeepers Monument in Ottawa and the War Memorial. The one on the left is real, but it's not the entire plan. The one on the right, of course, more reflects what Canada's done as one of the most warlike countries in the world at the right time for the right reason. And of course, we've talked about Lester Pearson and the good work that he did back in the day. Just to not recap a whole lot, but peacekeeping, to me, peacekeeping, quote unquote, changed Cold War and post-Cold War. You know, during the Cold War, it was interstate. Turkey and Greece, Cyprus, best example. Two nations that were having a problem with each other, wanted somebody in between, and Canada fulfilled that role admirably. And others that have already been talked about: Sinai, Golan, Hispanic countries in South America, and so on. My only really issue with Cyprus was in 1974, I was stationed in Baden, and Canadians living in Germany at the time used to take the 707 or the Yukon down to Greece, down to Cyprus for a week on the beach. Unfortunately, we our trip booked in 1974 when the Greeks and the Turks decided to have a punch-up over Greece, so we had to cancel that holiday. So I'm really PO to the Greeks and the Turks. Peacekeeping now, or peace whatever now, post-Cold War, and again it's been mentioned, is not interstate anymore, it's intrastate, between a hopefully legitimate government and forces trying to overthrow that government or disrupt the population, the operation, and so on. It's you know, a chaotic mix of tribal militias, terrorist groups, you know, dysfunctional governments, corrupt governments, that sort of thing. And it's changed from the Blue Beret guys. A lot of it's changed to combat, and a lot of it's changed to folks coming home in pine boxes. There's been 1,300 peacekeepers killed on peacekeeping operations since 2002. So it is not without risk at all. Now, did we abandon peacekeeping, or did peacekeeping abandon us? Now, through things like Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Srebrenica, the horrible, horrible things that went on there, not just Canada. You know, people like to blame Stephen Harper sometimes for, you know, getting us out of that. But looking at July 2016, you know, we only had 103 people on operations. USA had 68, Australia had 39, and so on. A whole bunch of other folks got the same message, that the UN is really not doing what we collectively hoped, thought, wished they would do. So a whole bunch of countries represented by the flags there did the same thing as Canada, and just stopped or seriously cut back the amount of effort we put into sort of classic UN peacekeeping. So how did we get here, and why? The how we got here, and this is not critical. You know, Justin Trudeau won the election fair and square. He has a perfect right to do what he's doing as the leader of the country. And it's laudable, what we're trying to do. The overall goal of what we're trying to do is very laudable. We need to do a couple things. Make sure it's in Canada's interest in some way, and world peace obviously is in Canada's interest. But the note at the bottom, you know, kind of struck me. Nostalgia is seldom a wellspring for sensible policy. And, you know, the Prime Minister grew up in an environment where obviously his dad was involved in things, and they knew the Pearsons and so on, and all that was great. But is it nostalgia? Is it a sensible policy? Now, the why we got here, and this may be a little cynical, but I think there's a fair bit of truth to it. The United Nations Security Council election is in 2021. And we, Canada, through the Prime Minister, which is his perfect right to do that, are determined that we're going to win a seat on the Security Council in 2021. Norway and Ireland are our two competitors. And, you know, to be honest, what would a 2-year stint on the Security Council do for us? Not much, other than make us feel good about ourselves. Because frankly, the Security Council has not accomplished very much since I've been paying any attention to it. There was a fellow named Anthony Banbury, who was the Assistant Secretary General for Field Support until the 5th of February this year. And he quit for a whole bunch of reasons, and you can read his quote there. Obviously, he's not complimentary about his organization. And the Peacekeeping Office in the United Nations is overstretched, undermanned, serial scandals with respect to sexual abuse, disease, self-serving bureaucracy, a whole bunch of bad things. The United Nations would be a great organization if they fulfilled the mandate that they were instituted to fulfill. But in my view and others' view, I think they haven't done that. Now, when we get into doing things like peacekeeping, like Afghanistan, like whatever sort of military civilian operations we get into, there's primarily two departments involved. DFATE, or now Department of Global Affairs, and D&D. Now the question is, who's in charge? And who should be in charge are the folks at the bottom with most of the skill sets, the vast majority of the skill sets that will allow that mission to be successful. And you know, and I'm pretty sure Nick Grimshaw would agree with me from his experience in Bosnia and certainly Afghanistan, that it's necessary to have those folks from Global Affairs involved and other civilians involved, but to me, they shouldn't be running the show. There's always, between D&D and Global Affairs, there's a huge amount of competition, unhealthy competition about, you know, I'm in charge, no, I'm in charge. Now, I'm biased, having worn a uniform, but to me, there's no way that the military should be relied on a whole lot more for leadership, but that's just not the way it works. Now, I will certainly give the Minister of National Defense credit. He has been trying very hard to raise the level of awareness about the risk that we are facing, and I give him great credit for that. The guy on the top, who I got to know extremely well and personally close up through the Taliban detainee issue, having been locked in a room with him for way too long, reading 20,000 pages of Taliban detainee documents, looking for that needle in the haystack that just wasn't there. And again, not to be too critical of my friend Stéphane Dion, but can you pick out the peacekeeping expert over there? I don't think it's the guy on the left. Now, and again, I don't mean this to be too partisan, but the point is we've got people like Stéphane and others who are well-meaning, are educated, are sincere, but don't have the breadth of knowledge and experience that people like Lou McKenzie have, or people like Nick Grimshaw have in doing the job. The other aspect, the other political aspect is, you know, making the call. The government, the Prime Minister, is perfectly within his rights to make the commitment. You know, there's a lot of stuff going. You may know there's an election down south in a couple of months, and a lot of talk from Donald Trump and Hillary and so on and so on. The President of the United States has far less power within his government, or her government, than the Prime Minister of Canada does within our government. The Prime Minister of Canada is, and I say this about any Prime Minister, whether it's Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, whoever, can be virtually a dictator. And some enjoy that more than others. But my point in making the call is the Prime Minister is perfectly within his rights to make that call. However, it would be nice to have it validated at least by Parliament. And people dumped on Stephen Harper for a bunch of things, but he did bring all those things to Parliament for a vote. And that just, and to quote him, he said, "It's important to be able to tell diplomats, relief workers, and soldiers on dangerous missions that Canada's parliamentarians believe in their objectives and support what they're doing." And he said that just before we upped the ante in Afghanistan. So we did hold votes, and the Liberals should hold votes. Any government should hold votes and debates on that in the House of Commons, just to educate Canadians and nothing else about what we're getting into. Now, where we're getting into, undoubtedly, is Africa. And to put it mildly, it's a complex and dangerous place. There is no safe spot in Africa. Absolutely none. Now, what we've been doing, and this all goes back to, you know, are we ready, is a lot of fact finding, and that's good. That helps inform folks within government who you know, don't have the background and knowledge and experience, helps inform them so that they can make a smarter decision or stay out of things that are dumb. Now they're taking some time doing that, and I applaud that. Are they stalling because they're really not sure which way they're going? There might be an element of that, but that's, if you don't know where you're going, then for God's sake, don't try to go there. So stalling is not necessarily a bad thing. So they've been around to all these countries, the DRC, Uganda. Well, I got Uganda twice. I guess they went there twice. One of those was supposed to be Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania to check out the lay of the land. Not necessarily to go there, but just, because we're going to be operating in some place there, and those other countries around it are going to have a role to play, perhaps with a hub, support hub, that sort of thing. So we've come down, I think, to a number of candidates that seem to be, these seem to be the folks that are talked about most as places we will wind up going. Chad, DRC, Central African Republic, and Mali. And each of those places already has a dog's breakfast of multinational missions. So where do we go? The odds-on favorite, I think, is Mali. From everything I'm seeing and reading and hearing, and I'm part of an internet or email chat group, I'll call it, with about 20 retired general officers, admirals, diplomats, one member of parliament, some media, some great media like Matt Fisher, and we discuss a whole lot of things. And there's a lot of wisdom in that group, and because they've got networks, far and wide, and Mali seems to be the place for one big reason, I think, and that's France is there now. Because all these other places, there's a whole bunch of countries involved who are, not as reliable as we maybe would like to have somebody to work with. France is pretty reliable. I mean, they've got a ton of experience. Mali is a former French colony. We've worked with the French in Mali before, so they're pretty reliable. And, to go back to the Prime Minister's, what I think one of his objectives is the Security Council seat. France does have some sway in that venue, and if we earn brownie points from them for going to Mali with them, that might help the cause of the Security Council. I will point out that there have been 100 peacekeepers killed in Mali in the last 2 years, so it is not a safe place. So just a little bit about Mali. It's a former French colony. The area is Manitoba and Saskatchewan combined, about 14.5 million people. It is a democracy, multi-party democracy, not a smooth, stable one. They've got an economy that's mostly agriculture and fishing. They've got some natural resources. Their per capita GDP is $707 compared to Canada's 41,000. The average salary is about $1,500. They're 176th on the Human Development Index, which tells you what kind of environment we'd be in. We're 9th, by the way. We're not first. I think Norway's first. The language is primarily French plus 40 African languages. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we would do relatively well in Mali, because of our, generally speaking, our capacity for French. One of the challenges, of course, is the makeup of the country, the demographics. They're 90% Muslim, 5% Christian, 5% indigenous. And there's a number of bad guys, some Tuareg rebels, some Islamist rebels, mainly up in the north, and something called the Messina Liberation Front. So it's not a pretty place. The keys to mission success, and Nick, talked about some of them. But the big one for me is a realistic assessment of all aspects. We better cover everything. D&D is extremely good at that kind of contingency planning, of covering everything. Global Affairs is pretty good at that. But we need to understand the mandate, the expectations, what defines success. If we don't know what defines success, then we better not start. The force requirements, how many people do we need, how much stuff do we need? Basic, they're going to be based obviously somewhere in Mali. We're going to have one base, two bases. There's going to be a support base somewhere else. There's going to be a transit base like we had in and out of Afghanistan. And security, how do we provide security for that place? The kind of training we need, which has got to be culture and mission specific. The kind of threats we're facing, I mentioned a couple of the rebel groups. Rules of engagement have to be very, very clear. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Command and control has to be effective and swift. And using the term United Nations and command and control together doesn't imbue me with confidence. Personnel protection. We're there to do a job, but any commander will tell you, his primary concern is protecting his folks. And ally support. In France, I'm not really comfortable in Africa anywhere, but I'm probably more comfortable in Mali with a reliable ally like France. Logistics support, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And exit strategy. What is plan B? If things really turn to hell in a handbasket, how do we get our folks out of there? The big thing is, for me, is go in there with your eyes wide open, or you're going to hurt yourself. But people say, the UN's going to pay us. That's great. They're going to pay our soldiers. Well, the UN will pay about $1,300 a month per soldier. That's about $12 million a year for our kind of deployment. That might pay a Bangladeshi soldier, but won't help D&D much. That 12 million bucks might pay for the fuel for one rotation. And Canadian government in the past, because we've always got those kind of payments from the UN, but we've always used that to offset our dues to the UN. So it doesn't come back to D&D, it's such a piddling amount it wouldn't matter. And of course there's incremental mission costs. That was one of the banes of the Afghanistan mission. There's about $3 billion. D&D doesn't plan to go to war. It just happens. They don't plan for floods, ice storms, they just happen. And D&D has to respond, and they do wonderfully every time. But there's a cost. And in Afghanistan, that cost at one point was about $3 billion that is supposed to come back to the department. It never did. There's going to be incremental costs with whatever mission this is. And I predict that, and I blame our government too, but I don't think this government's going to be any different, that will be a challenge in compensating D&D for those kind of costs. They have no option but to spend. So on the costing side, a whole bunch of countries, mostly third world folks, Bangladesh I mentioned, and so on, a whole bunch of other ones, have done a lot of this because, frankly, that's how they pay their soldiers, is through this. Now, rules of engagement, and Nick touched on that, they've got to be robust. And everybody, all of our allies in there have got to be on the same level. We've got to be able to action intelligence, and we've got to be able to preemptively use deadly force. This is not sort of sit back, wait till you're shot at. You've got to use intelligence, you've got to use understanding of the enemy and so on to do that. And because ultimately, one of the things we're there to do is protect civilians. And if we've got people like IS who we know are going to kill civilians, we've got to be able to kill them before they get to pull the trigger. And rules of engagement can be constraining. Just an example, different context, but the F-18s in Iraq and Syria, an F-18 pilot, they did great work over there. They should still be there, that's another story. An F-18 pilot could not make the decision to drop the bomb. He could make the decision to not drop the bomb, but he couldn't make the decision to drop it. That decision was made in Qatar by 4 people. There was a pilot, a lawyer, an EOD guy, and an intelligence guy. And any one of those 4 people had a red card. And they were getting stuff pretty much real time from the cockpit, from the sensors. And any one of those guys could say, nope, don't like it, and don't drop. So the pilot could not override those. And sometimes that caused some problems. And there's some good reasons for it. But that to say, the rules of engagement have to be robust. They also have to be realistic to say that we can't afford mistakes. Because if we kill one wrong person, that's going to be the story. Never mind that we might have saved 500 if we killed one wrong one. What's that movie? Helen Mirren is in it. Anyway, I forget it, but it's a great movie. It's about that. Effective command and control. Can we expect effective command and control from an organization like that, and that's the UN Security Council, in any kind of a realistic or timely way? I don't think so. Non-UN forces have gone in and saved UN operations. In Sierra Leone, Mali, and the Congo, all forces from the Brits, from the French, and from the African Intervention Unit went into those places and saved the UN's butt because they couldn't command and control anything. Or can we expect decent command and control from places like that are manned by Canadians, Americans, Brits, French, folks who are knowledgeable, have real-time connectivity, have the communications capability to actually make a decision and actually transmit it in real time so something good happens. UN command and control is an oxymoron. And the biggest example, I think most of us are probably aware of, is Rwanda and Romeo Dallaire. We served together in Europe. He was Army, I was Air Force, but we knew each other casually. And of course, that didn't turn out so well. And Matt Fisher, who's a great journalist, if there's a crappy place in the world, Matt Fisher's been there reporting on it. And I was chatting with him the other day, and he was reminding me of a conversation. He was with Romeo Dallaire in Kigali or wherever they were. He was on the phone with Kofi Annan, who was not the Secretary General at the time, but he was Romeo's boss in New York. And Romeo was trying to tell him the extent of what was going on, and it was, as we know, it was absolutely horrific. And Matt could hear Kofi Annan in his smooth voice reassuring the general that, no, sorry, General, you must be exaggerating, it can't be that bad. And it's Friday, and there's a long weekend here in New York, so we'll get back to you Tuesday, and we'll sort it out. And of course, we all know what happened. It didn't turn out well. And one of Romeo's quotes was, the worst eyes that haunt me are the eyes of those people who totally bewildered. Mission Commander Romeo Dallaire told PBS's Frontline, they're looking at me in my blue beret and asking, what in the hell happened? How come I'm dying here? And they were right. So I don't have a lot of faith in the UN. I do have faith in the French and the Brits and the Americans and ourselves. We need to make sure that we've got control of the command and control. Training is a big issue. Again, Nick touched on that, but military and civilian. And in Afghanistan, obviously it was mostly military, but there were a lot of civilians, and many of them were really, really top-notch, first-class people. But there was a bit of a challenge in getting DFATE at that time to put their people through the kind of training they really actually needed to go do the things they were doing at the PRC, Bridge Reconstruction Team, PRT. PRCs are the guys that do other things. But it takes time, and it's mission specific, has to be obviously related to the threat, has to be the ROE, has to be the culture, combination of military and civilian operations, and sometimes that worked well, sometimes it doesn't work well. There were some successes in Afghanistan, but I think it had to develop, and there were some cultural issues between DND and DFATE at that time. And a lot of it is understanding. I don't know how many people here are familiar with the Rideau Institute. It's actually about 3 people. It is a self-proclaimed voice of the NDP federally. And they bring up, well, we have to do things by the peacekeeping principles, which are consent of main conflicting parties, impartiality, and defensive use of force. Okay, that sounds like Cyprus to me. So, and that's a Chapter 6 operation that says, there's no imminent conflict and so on. And there's a form of truce. So in Mali, for example, are we going to get consent from the Islamic State? No, I don't think so. Are we going to be impartial between Malians and Islamic State people who are slaughtering women and children? I don't think we need to be impartial in that situation. And are we going to use defensive ROE against somebody like the Islamic State? No, I'm sorry. We've got to kill them first. Mali will be a Chapter 7 operation, which recognizes there's a serious threat to world or regional peace, and the UN force is charged to deal with that. And to take the Rideau Institute definition and put it to Afghanistan, of course, it was very kinetic. We had tons of battles with the Taliban, but it was also population-centric, very, very much. There was protecting and engaging the population, rebuilding structures, institutions, training, local infrastructure, dealing with the villagers, at their level. So, are we ready for Mali? I think our soldiers are indeed ready, but are the rest of them? Now, operations there's a saying that operations is the rose and logistics is the stem upon which it grows. Because you can have the world's greatest operation, if you can't support it, it's not going to last very long. So we need a massive amount of support for something like Mali. We need airlift support. We only have 5 C-17s. We've got 17 Hercs, and we've got 5 Airbuses. And of course, they're doing a whole bunch of other stuff. Are we going to have aviation support in theater, whether it's Chinooks, Griffins? The Griffins and Chinooks did tremendous work in Afghanistan. And we're going to need aviation support from somebody. If it's not from the French, then it might have to be from us. Personnel protection is critical. Things like the LAV and the Cougar and the Nyala, which is the bottom right guy. We need to protect our folks. We don't need to do what we did in Afghanistan. Now, this is not an actual event. It's an IED, how an IED deals with the Iltis Jeep. And of course, we sent our folks to Afghanistan at Iltis Jeeps initially. We learned that lesson, and we can't ever do that. So we need to protect our folks. And simple things like feeding. We got a bunch of folks we've got to feed, and I suspect we'll probably wind up feeding some of the population as well, because that's kind of what we do. Even if, and probably especially if, the bottom picture, if the Governor General shows up for lunch. He needs to be fed. Things like communicating home. You know, in Afghanistan, there are computers, folks can get on the phone every day, if they're not, you know, out doing Taliban stuff. I mean, these are all, you know, individually sort of little things, but they are really, really important. That if we're going to run an operation, especially for an extended period of time, you've got to have those things in place. And medical. You know, that's the Kandahar Institute of Surgical Science, and I know Nick is very familiar with that place. Bottom left picture, there's going to be blood on the floor. There's going to be blood on the floor, and it's going to be Canadian blood, and we need to be able to look after it. Now, I have no idea what kind of facilities the French have there. I'm sure they have something. We'll probably rely on them, but I think we'll need our own medical folks there at some level. Bottom right picture is just me and a young guy named Dennis Marion, who's a Canadian medical officer that was in Afghanistan. Our folks are going to get hurt, and we need to be able to look after them. And the other challenge, of course, is we've got so many other missions going on. You know, we've got a mission in Ukraine, we've got a mission in the Mediterranean, Iraq and Kuwait is ongoing. We've got a mission in Niger, in Latvia, Poland, and other ongoing commitments. And that's on top of all the UN ones that Nick mentioned. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on. Canada has a lot of capacity because we've got people with an awful lot of capacity, but there is a limit. So we do need to make sure that Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces capacity is able to handle it. Eyes wide open. And finally, you know, Canadians love, quote unquote, peacekeeping. But are they ready if this turns to that? And I think it's unrealistic to think that there's not going to be some of that. And just like in Afghanistan, Canadians loved what we're doing, and they should have. They loved the people who were doing it, and they should have. But the enthusiasm for the mission obviously drained every time there was another Trenton arrival, and I was at a few of those. You know, the enthusiasm drained, and that's normal. So we've got to communicate with Canadians politically. We've got to make sure they understand what we're getting into. We've got to make sure, I mean, you know, if I'm government, I want to make sure I understand what we're getting into and what the risks are. And not just the political risk, but the human risk, and they're both substantial. And somebody earlier mentioned PTSD. You know, we're going to get, you know, another wave of PTSD from wherever we go. There's going to be another wave of that. It'll probably be measurable, and it's inevitable, but it's something we have to be aware of. Prevent or condition people to the extent possible, but be prepared to deal with when it inevitably happens. Do we have a role that we should be prepared to play? Yeah, I think we do. But it goes back to the little slide of the little baby with his eyes wide open. Let's make sure our eyes wide open and we understand what we're getting into so we don't get too surprised. We will get surprised, there's no question. So we don't get too surprised. Anyway, I said it'd be a little bit political. It was. I hope it added some perspective. I hope it added a little bit of reality check for some things we're going to face. And I look forward to the rest of the session and a chat afterwards. Thanks so much.